Turks and Caicos and any viewers on digital media, welcome to Conversations. Conversations is a show designed to discuss and explore the national issues of our day, and by doing so we hope to address concerns the average citizen grapples with in their everyday lives. We plan to cover a wide spectrum of current events, with some programs focusing on issues such as national affairs, government and politics, business, and other issues that may arise that affect all of us. Conversations panel today includes Mr. Norman Hamilton, a business owner, an insurance brokerage and real estate agency. He has also served as chairman on several government boards and twice as chair of the National Tourist Board. We also have former member of the House and Minister of Border Control and Employment, Mr. DonHue Gardiner, who is a practicing attorney specializing in immigration and corporate law. And myself, Ewan Menzies, I'm a medical practitioner and one principal of Associated Medical Practices, resident of the TCI for the last 35 years, a past chair of the Health Practitioners Board, and I'm doing the introduction only because I've been landed by the group with the provision of refreshments and our kitchen top venue in Cooper Jack, Providenciales. Following the pilot program, we envisage other interesting guests and an interactive audience perhaps. From time to time we'll have different invitees joining us to discuss various topics. So with the help of our special panel today, we'll be discussing as a general topic the structure of government. How does it work? Let's start with Mr. Gardiner, who's definitely our expert today in this area.
Thank you, Ewan, Norman, and it's always good to be with friends and we can have a long conversation about these issues today. As we all know that the government as we know it is made up by three branches. There's the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. And these are co-equal branches of government. Today, however, we want to focus more on the legislature. The primary role of the legislature is to make laws for the good governance of this territory, of these islands. In order to do so, there must be members of this legislature. And so every 4 years or shorter, as the case may be, persons are elected and or appointed to Parliament for the purpose, the sole purpose of making law. Before a bill can become law, the Constitution requires a matter of or a measure of consultation with the public or with interested bodies or interested stakeholders, as it is referred to, so as to get a wider view from the elected members or from the executive, who are the ones mostly pushing the legislation.
Do you mind, can I actually just stick a pin there?
Yeah.
And maybe go back a little bit and discuss how how people get to sit in the legislature and who sits in the legislature, which in this case is our House of Assembly.
Yeah.
Around the world, they're termed different things. Some call them the House of Deputies, some call them the House of Representatives, but here we call it the House of Assembly. Speak to how people get to the House of Assembly and who make up the members in the House of Assembly.
Well, the House of Assembly in our case is made up of 20 members, 15 of whom are elected by the people from 10 electoral districts. The 10th electoral district sends 5 members to Parliament. That is our at-large electoral district. And the other 9 districts return one, the other 10 districts return 1 member each. And so what you have is, and then you have the appointed members, you've got 2 members that are appointed by the governor acting in his discretion, a member that is appointed by the governor after consultation with the premier, and then there's a member who's appointed by the governor after consultation with the leader of the opposition. And then, of course, there's the Attorney General that makes up the 20 members. There's a speaker that can be elected from outside of Parliament. It doesn't have to be, but in most cases, that is
You mean appointed from outside?
that is elected from outside.
It's
Because
elected.
it's elected by the Parliament from
Ah,
outside.
okay.
And so the Speaker, if he is a member of the House, then the House has 20 members. If the Speaker is a member from outside the House, then the House has 21 members. But the Speaker is the prerogative of the majority of the members of the House voting for the Speaker from inside the House as an elected or an appointed member, or as an outsider who is then elected and brought inside by the members to preside over the House. Now, as I was saying, if a government, let me start again. There are 2 ways a bill can become law. One is by a private member's motion, which means that someone outside of the government, outside of the cabinet, has the privilege of drafting legislation, having it published in the Gazette, and then having it laid on the table of the House to be read the first, second, and third time so that it could become law. In order to do so, because in our context, you will know that there are not many of those bills that actually follow through. Many times, it is because of the cost constraints that members will face. The publication in the Gazette is a requirement, and a member must pay for that out of his or her own pocket. And they must also pay for someone, if they are not legally trained in legislative drafting, to draft that bit of legislation for them. And so you have that venue. And then you have the government motions, which are drafted by the Attorney General's chambers and are brought by ministers. Now, before a minister can bring a bill, that bill is required to have, or the general ethos of that bill must be discussed or consulted upon with the general public, and in some cases with a smaller group of stakeholders who may know the subject area. Once that consultation is finished, then the ministry, having consulted through the cabinet, would then send a paper on to the Attorney General's chambers with directions. And the Attorney General's chambers, based on those directions, will draft a bill. That draft bill will then come back to the cabinet, who may or may not approve it, or who may approve it with certain amendments. Once those amendments are done, there may still be need for further consultation, depending on the subject matter. And once the bill has, however, been approved by the cabinet, it then goes on to the House of Assembly.
Perhaps you'd like to discuss there what's the makeup of the cabinet and how it functions, what role it has. You give one function, presumably there are others.
Well, the cabinet is the executive. As I mentioned earlier, there's an executive, a legislature, and a judiciary. The executive is largely drawn from the legislature, and so persons who have been elected or appointed to Parliament may then be chosen by the Premier to be members of the cabinet. Whomever wins the most seats in the Parliament, the leader of that party then becomes the Premier. The Premier would then recommend to the governor persons from the Parliament whom he or she will want to sit in cabinet with them. And so in the cabinet, you've got the governor as president, you've got the deputy governor, you've got the Attorney General, and then you've got the Premier and her ministers, his or her ministers. And those are the persons who are charged with the day-to-day management of the country. If it were a company, for example, the voters are the shareholders. The the the
Directors.
the legislature will be the board of directors, but the executive is the management committee, and those are the persons who the executive reports to the parliament, and the parliament is accountable to the people. And so once a bill has actually worked its way up, or in some cases worked its way down and then up again to the cabinet, and if the cabinet approves it, then it is sent on to the House of Assembly for the House of Assembly to give its consent to that bill becoming law. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are certain bills that may be brought by members who are not members of the cabinet. Those bills are restricted to non-financial bills. Any bill that may have a financial bearing on the public purse must come from the cabinet, must have the consent of the governor before it can actually be received into the House. And so if, for example, a private member wants to make a bill that will bring a bill that would call for the paving of a public road, because that has financial implications, that bill must come from the cabinet, or that private member must show that the governor has consented to that before he or she would be allowed to bring that bill to the House.
It was interesting the other day, and I didn't understand, I've never been in cabinet, the workings of cabinet, and you put forward the idea about cabinet being consensus. I'd always thought that in the House of Assembly and cabinet you'd have votes and you'd count the votes, but that's apparently not the case. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
It is certainly not the case. In the House of Assembly, it's a matter of absolute votes. Either you've got the votes to pass it or you don't, and if you don't, then you lose, and if you do, then you win. In cabinet, it's a matter of consensus, because cabinet is a place where persons will come, or members will come, to thrash out ideas. And if there is no general dissension in the policy position that is being brought, then that position that cabinet has taken will be the advice that cabinet gives to the governor, and the governor is then will then act on that advice, or will decide not to act on that advice, in which case the governor will then pass it on to a Secretary of State for his or her approval. But there is no vote in cabinet, and so therefore, when a matter is brought to cabinet, in some, depending on the view a particular governor has on what the word consensus means, it may require the consent of all the members, or it may require the consent of the majority of the members, or as long as no one dissents openly or vehemently. And so there's no opportunity in cabinet where they go around and ask individual members of cabinet, do you agree or you disagree?
Okay.
Following the discussions, the governor will then determine whether or not the discussion goes in favor of an agreement or in favor of or against an agreement. However, a big thing in cabinet is the role of the Attorney General and the role of the Deputy Governor, because they are not necessarily, well, they are not voted on by the public, and the extent to which they are able to stall or delay or defeat motions that are brought by the elected government has been a grave concern, certainly in the last government and in this government, and I'm sure in governments past, because in situations where the people of this country would have elected people to represent them, and to have the will of the elected government defeated or stalled or delayed by persons who are not elected can become problematic in the cabinet setting.
So within the cabinet, their positions are equal as any elected member. They don't just give advice to cabinet, they're actually
full-fledged members of cabinet with the right to have a discussion on any of the issue that is raised, and with the right to voice their objection to any of the matters being raised.
Well, what is your, as someone who has sat in cabinet and someone who understands and appreciates sometimes the complications of what it means to be a full and democratic society where you have full democratic government. I mean, how do you feel about that? I mean, particularly as someone who's ran in a political campaign, won it, and you're sitting there and having your policy positions, which you've most likely won a mandate for. In some cases, you've campaigned on them. How does it feel to have those policy positions being frustrated by people who are appointed, not elected?
Well, my view is that no one who has not faced the public in a general elections should have the right to defeat or to delay or in some other means frustrate the will of the elected government. In fact, my view is that even in the House of Assembly, unless a person would have been tested at the ballot and can earn a seat by getting the majority of votes in any one of the constituencies, then that person should not be should not be a member of the parliament. And it will necessarily translate that that person should not be a member of the cabinet. My view is that we should seek to move to a Bermuda, at least a Bermuda style, where the cabinet is presided over by the premier. The premier and his or her ministers will discuss the issues and then make a recommendation to the governor as to whether or not the governor should move forward with these or not. And then the governor will decide in his discretion that I think this is not the best course at this time, or I think if you take this back and you modify it in these ways, then perhaps we can go forward, or I will readily accept your advice. And in cases where he doesn't accept the advice, there is always the backstop whereby the governor can refer these matters to the Secretary of State, who can stop anything from happening. The idea that you may have, or you could have, a person who is not directly accountable to the public through the ballot box, having a say whereby those persons can stop the will of an elected government. And you have to remember that when people go out and campaign, they will set out a manifesto as to what they wish to achieve. And the public, knowing what they have in that manifesto, would have voted for them or voted against them. And so when a government comes to power, based on his or on that government's manifesto, the public knows what they're buying. And my view is that once that policy initiative is not anathema to the democratic principles that we have all been brought up with and we would expect and want in this society, is not going to infringe upon the freedoms and rights of the individual, is not going to do some crazy stuff, then that view, that position that the government takes should actually go through, and have the government that brings it, have them test it as to whether they've made a good or a bad decision at the next elections. And that's the way it's done in every other democratic society. And my view is, and I've always said when I've had conversations with UK ministers or with governors in the TCI, we want what you have. And this will not fly in the UK. We are British citizens. We are British overseas territory citizens. Give us what you have.
So do the other overseas territories, say Bermuda you referred to before, and does that have appointed members in the House? Or
in Bermuda they don't. In Bermuda they have a House and a Senate. Their Senate is 100% appointed, but the House is 100% elected. And the Premier can choose from the House or the Senate persons to serve in the cabinet as ministers. But the governor doesn't sit in the cabinet. And so the Premier presides over the cabinet makes a decision, and the decision of the cabinet is then referred to the governor, And the governor, in some cases, because Bermuda is in a special situation, in fact, the United Kingdom government decided that they are not interested in seeing another Bermuda created because the Bermuda Constitution limits how involved the UK can become in their domestic issues. In fact, when it brings to mind when the issue of the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs are a peculiar set of Muslims from China, and after 9/11, everything else going on, the Bermuda government decided that we will accept Uyghurs who are in, I think it was Guantanamo base in Cuba that the Americans had held. We will accept, I think it was 5 or 8 of them. It may be more, maybe less. And the UK government was against it, but they were not, because the Constitution had given the rights to immigration to the local government in Bermuda. The UK government didn't have the right to intervene. And those persons are still in Bermuda enjoying Bermudan citizenship and have all the freedoms that comes with it. In our situation, even though immigration has been devolved to the local government, if we were to bring a bill or anything that the UK government or the governor feels that the UK government will not be pleased with, then the governor can override it, or the governor can refer it to a Secretary of State who can override it. And the reason why I believe it refers to a Secretary of State is if it's a matter of foreign policy, then it will refer to the Foreign Secretary. If it's a matter of health policy, it will refer to the Secretary of State for Health. And so the governor can refer to whichever Secretary of State.
A couple of follow-up questions to that. One is you mentioned the Senate in Bermuda. How is the Senate appointed?
The Senate is appointed by the governor. The majority of members, I don't recall the exact number, are appointed by the governor acting in accordance with the advice of the Premier.
Right.
And a certain number, a minority, acting in accordance with the advice of the Leader of the Opposition.
So a bit like new members of the House of Lords or something like
Absolutely.
that.
Absolutely. It is a House of Lords in certain instances.
And the way it functions.
In the way it functions,
yeah.
save that in the House of Lords has, if you're appointed, you're a permanent member.
Yeah. Right.
And to that extent, it is different.
So is Cayman Island then, that's nearer to us, is it? It's different than Bermuda. Do they have the same system of appointed members?
The TCI and I believe Montserrat and Anguilla are the ones that have appointed members. The others don't have appointed members. Certainly in the Atlantic and Caribbean region of the overseas territories, the 6 overseas territories in the Atlantic and Caribbean region, I think only the TCI. My recollection is that only the TCI and Anguilla, and I may be wrong, but I believe it's Montserrat that have appointed members. The Cayman Islands do not have appointed members.
So on the scale of autonomy, it seems to be that we're rather junior in the scheme of things, in that we seem to have appointed members, we seem to have appointed members in the executive who are not ex officio, and we seem to have a governor who sort of acts a bit with the backstop of the Secretary of State, acts as the House of Lords.
Well, acts as the Queen. Now, let me just correct myself, because when I say that there are not appointed members, I meant appointed members to the legislature. Mm-hmm. In the cabinet in the Cayman Islands, in the cabinet in Montserrat, in the cabinet in the BVI, in the cabinet in Anguilla, there are appointed members. The Attorney General, the Deputy Governor, they are members of the cabinet in those territories as well. Right. The only territory that does not have an appointed member, other than a minister who has been appointed by the Premier, or recommended for appointment by the Premier, is Bermuda. In Bermuda, there are no ex officio members of the cabinet. There are no ex officio members of the House. And so,
if you like, I mean, not to cut you cross, DonHue, but I think Bermuda is the only overseas territory that has a carbon copy, if you will, of the government in the UK.
Yeah.
generally speaking.
Well, Bermuda was
As you
meant to
say, they
become-
don't like it, perhaps.
No, they don't like it because when Bermuda
In that
got
case.
Bermuda is an instant where you have full internal self-government, and at the time, the UK's position is that they made a mistake. They will not acknowledge it, but they made a mistake because they gave Bermuda full internal self-government without a timetable for independence, and Bermuda had said to them, once we have a full internal self-government, we will become independent in 2 years. Of course, 2 years came and went and they never became independent. And they were left with their constitution that was meant to be a pre-independence constitution, but they never went. And the UK has vowed that that situation is not going to happen again. And if you want full internal self-government, as you have in Bermuda, you have to set a timetable for independence within 18 to 24 months. And after 24 months, whether you like it or not, you will be gone. And you'll be on your own.
Let's speak to something else in the makeup of our House of Assembly. Something that was added about 2 elections ago after the interim administration, you had these at-large constituency. And one of my views on this is that I think if you have an elected body, all those people that sit in that body should go there the same way.
Absolutely.
The process of getting there should be exactly the same. And so this sort of a hodgepodge system we have with some people appointed, some elected in constituencies, some elected, countrywide. It almost seems to me to be silly in a way. And there has to be a better way to do it, because now you have people who sit in the same parliament because they won an at-large constituency, think that they're more important, or they should have.
Well, there are four ways you can come to Parliament.
Yeah.
Well, there are 5 ways if you're the Speaker. Yeah. But other than the Speaker, there are 4. You can either come from one of the single-member constituencies, you can come from the at-large constituency, you can come as appointed member, or in the case of the Attorney General, by
virtue of the office.
Virtue of the office, ex officio. My view is that perhaps if we want to have at-large seats, then we can perhaps, let's say,
let's create a Senate.
Wasn't that the advice when we were looking at this? They had, I think it was an Australian lady who was giving advice, and her advice was that you had proportional representation. You had all at-large candidates, but my understanding of it was that wasn't acceptable to either the government at the time.
Well, it's not acceptable because you have constituencies with peculiar issues. And when I represented Middle Caicos and North Caicos in Parliament, their issues are not the same issues that you find in Grand Turk or here in Provo. And on certain positions, they take a different view. And if you're going to run everybody at large, I think the smaller islands, the less developed islands, will have a less say in how the country runs. And that is why in big countries like the United States of America, for example, you may have one member of the House for each 300,000 population in that state. But no matter how big the state is, you have 2 senators, because it is one of the primary rules is to ensure that the small islands, the small states are not going to be overrun and have their will or not have a say. Because if I have to run at large, and I know that in Provo is where I'm going to get the most of the votes, and in Salt Key, for example, there are only 27, 30 votes, a person will certainly pay more attention to where the votes are, i.e. Provo, and less attention to what Salt Key and Middle Caicos has to say. And in that case, what you have is a Provo view of what the country is, as opposed to a national view as to what all of us would want our country to be. I go back to what Norman said, and my view is that what we need is I believe we need a second chamber, and a second chamber that can act as a delay when you may have a government who is gung-ho on pushing something through without proper consultation or without proper involvement of the people, and giving an opportunity or a second opportunity for a debate on the issue. And so you may decide, for example, you want to have a Senate, and let's say you want to have that Senate with 6 members. And so those 6 members can be elected at large, and the top 6 can sit. But when it comes to the House of Representatives, it must be a more personal thing, where that person brings, is closer to the ground and brings a more grassroots feel to what the aspirations of the people are.
Wasn't that also suggested by the lady who was doing the review when she
Sullivan, yes.
that suggested to have a Senate?
Well, I think the time has come that we will have that we should have a Senate. If we are going to have a Senate that is not elected, then I'm against it.
Yeah.
I believe that nobody should sit in making law for me or anybody else in this country who doesn't have my consent to do so. Laws, I think, should be made by the representative of the people with the consent of the governed.
Would it fit better for you then if you had a Senate that was voted on at large?
Yeah, well,
At the same time as the
I would prefer that, and I would
election.
advocate that.
Yes.
I would certainly advocate
That would make more sense.
It would make more sense to me, and I think it would fit more in line with where we are.
well, a true democratic system.
It is more democratic, and I think the brand of democracy that we practice in this country, in any other place, even in the UK with the House of Lords, will not be able to see the light of day. I believe that the time has come in this country where there has to be a greater participation of the public in the governing process and in the legislating process. And to do so will mean that there has to be the persons who represent them or who may seek to have their views become the law of this land should first have those views tested at the ballot box.
Very reasonable.
And then you have, and so once a bill has worked its way through, there's a first reading. And a first reading of a bill simply means that the person who is sponsoring it will move a motion that the bill be read a first time.
Is it actually read out in the House then?
The bill
Word
is not
for
read
word?
out. The bill is not read out.
But the
title
title,
is read out.
yeah.
And so the clerk of the House will get up and say, will basically read the title of the bill and give and the
Members can go and read it at their...
absolutely. And then after that, there's a second reading, and the rules of the House would require that unless the House decides otherwise, a bill should not be read a first and a second time at the same meeting, which will then give you an opportunity, once it's been read in the House, to send it out to the public and have the public get involved.
Does that mean the same day or the same meeting of that Parliament, that session of Parliament?
The same, not the same meeting, and a meeting can go on for 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 days.
Right.
In our case, the longest meeting that I've been involved in the old days would have been a 5-day meeting. Now, if a meeting of the House is adjourned to a date certain, it is a continuation of that meeting. If a meeting of the House is adjourned sine die, and you come back, it is a new meeting. And so...
What does sine die mean? It's
without,
Latin.
without a date.
Okay.
And so the Speaker can then at some time later, on giving the requisite notice, promulgate a date or give a date when the House will next meet. And when the House next meet, then that matter can come up again for a second and go through the rest of the readings. However, if the majority of the members of the House vote to suspend that rule, and this is what generally happens, and there's nothing wrong with that, on the face of it, there's nothing wrong with that, except where matters, where bills are of such a significance that it ought to have that delay, and it ought to have an opportunity for people to actually get involved and speak and call their representatives, and say that they're against it or say that they're for it, and march in the streets if necessary. But on minor bills that doesn't have that kind of significance, I am okay generally with a suspension of the rules to allow it to go through all of its readings in one at one meeting. But on major things, and we've done major stuff like national health insurance, like the integrity commission bills. We've done all of that at one meeting. That is just absolutely absurd, in my view, because those are earth changing. Those are that changes the landscape of the political atmosphere in this country forever, and not only the political landscape, but the whole landscape of governance, and those ought not to have that ought not to have happened.
Going back a long way into the early 90s with the National Insurance Board legislation, would that have been done in a quick way like that, or did that, you weren't around at that time?
Norman was around that time, not
Yeah.
in Parliament. He hasn't had that privilege yet.
Yeah, I can't recall though, to be honest. But I certainly agree with the sentiments that Donnie is expressing, that it would seem just wrong to have significant bills like
Pushed through.
Yeah, like NIB, NHIP, the Integrity Commission bills. These things have major impact on the body politic, and they certainly shouldn't be just pushed through like that. I mean, but hasn't that system actually been changed fundamentally, particularly because of the need to have these things go out to the
Well, there's
to
a need
public
there's a need for consultation,
public, yeah.
so the public will have the opportunity to consult
Right.
before the bill
Goes
during the construction of the bill.
But once the bill gets
But
to
once
Parliament,
the bill
it's
gets to
presented.
Parliament, then Parliament, if the majority of the members of Parliament decide, can do whatever Parliament wants. And what I find, even when I was in government, and even before I was in government, even since I've left government, is that the government of the day will seek to rush things through, and in many cases, even when they don't need to, because at the end of the day, the government has the majority of votes in any event, and the public will have their say, the opposition will have their say, and the government will have its way. But it is good. My view is that it is good practice. It is good for democracy to have a cooling off period, and that is why a Senate that can, or a body that can reconsider after you've had the push of politicians at the House level, can then consider, and you've got some time, and people may have to reflect on things, and I think that this may not be so good for us after all. And then the Senate can perhaps delay or pass a bill that is in some ways different, which then would require a conference of members of the House and the Senate coming together to then perfect a bill that can see its way through.
There have been some bills in recent times that have been forced through and adopted. How are they introduced? Like if they're, let's say, in the UK or in Europe, and they insist that we actually change the laws here, how are those changes made? Is it introduced by the governor, or can the governor?
The governor has the right, if a bill doesn't pass cabinet. So basically, a bill would normally come to cabinet and go to the House. If that doesn't happen, the governor can then send a bill on his own directly to the House. So if a government bill or a bill that has been sent directly by the governor to the House doesn't pass, then the governor has the right to then signify to the House that this is a bill of I forget the terminology that is used, and
It's called passed, and they can pass it in council. Maybe. That's something different.
It's something different.
Okay.
I'll get to orders and councils in a minute.
Right.
But the governor then can say, if the Parliament doesn't pass it, then the governor, having consulted with the Secretary of State, can then sign it into law and make it the law of the land.
And it originates from the governor's office then?
Yes,
Yeah.
that has never happened.
No.
That has never happened in my recollection. Another way, which has happened, is that a Secretary of State can cause a bill or to go to Her Majesty's Privy Council, and they can then decide that this is what the law is going to be. Like when we abolished the death penalty for murder, or the death penalty for treason, or that we decriminalized homosexuality. Those were done.
Decided in Privy Council?
Those were, yes.
And they resist.
they were extended to us by order in council. You have to remember as well that our Constitution is an order in council.
Right.
And so what happens is that the Privy Council then advises Her
So
Majesty.
does order in council mean derived from the authority derived from the Privy Council?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Her Majesty in council,
Yeah,
Privy Council.
yeah, okay.
Now the Privy Council in respect to the United Kingdom is the Privy Council that's the Privy Council in respect to us. There is a Privy Council, for example, in respect to the Bahamas or in respect of Jamaica.
And they're different.
And they're different. They're made up differently because these countries are independent, and so they would recommend as to who are members of the Privy Council as regards their issues, and there's not an opportunity because their constitution doesn't recognize the right to legislate by orders in council. In the overseas territories, there is that right of the Privy Council to do so.
During your last term as Minister in Government, do you remember any private members' bills being introduced and actually being passed?
There were no private members' bills passed. There was one introduced that was defeated. I'm not even sure it was defeated. Basically, it was a bill brought by the government's appointed member to change the jury legislation to bring it back to what it was pre-2000, pre the change. Many of the members decided that they were conflicted for one reason or the other, because many persons saw it as being connected to the SIPT trials that were about to begin or that had begun, and so they felt that they were conflicted. And so during my term, my last term in Parliament, that was the only bill that was passed.
But surely you
It was
mentioned
part
earlier,
That was brought.
you mentioned earlier the cost of doing that. You were saying that actually you have to advertise in the Gazette.
It has to be published in the Gazette.
How expensive is that? That's not expensive.
To publish a 10 to 15 page bill will probably run you in the vicinity of $1,000,
Right, okay.
which is anti-democratic. And I think the country has come to the position where the government where the parliament must have its own parliamentary draftspersons that are available to any member of parliament to draft bills.
Because
And
if
so-
you're unlucky enough not to be an attorney like yourself and you want to do a private member's bill, you'd have to pay a lot more than $1,000 to have that
you have
drafted.
to pay to have it drafted, you have to pay to have it published in the Gazette.
So,
And you can be looking at a few $1,000s to have a bill come that may or may not pass.
But couldn't the House itself, I mean, take up that issue where members of the House or the House shouldn't have to pay to have, excuse me, legislation printed or bills printed in the Gazette, because the Gazette is a government publication.
And it should. I think it's proper that it's printed in the Gazette.
Yeah, but it shouldn't
It's
cost
improper,
members. Yeah.
It's improper that a member should have to
Okay,
pay for it.
yes.
And I think
But couldn't the House deal with that?
I think the House can deal with it by legislation. On an issue like that, my view is that because it could potentially impact upon the revenue of the islands, will have to come from the cabinet. Because it could be considered something that impacts upon the revenue. And so, because a private member will have to normally pay, and a bill to now say he doesn't have to pay, I don't think a private member can bring that. It has to be brought by a government minister or a person from whom the governor has given his consent that it actually goes ahead. But those are things I think that if you want place to be, the parliament to be more democratic, there has to be a mechanism whereby private members, non-ministers, can bring a bill without a financial burden on them. And that is, and we are not there yet. We're certainly not there yet.
But you would think it would be something that every politician, every member of the House of Assembly would agree on.
Every member of the House of Assembly will agree on it, especially when you're in opposition.
That's a problem. Some people can only see the problems when they're in opposition.
Well, you know, I think every politician should suffer defeat, and every politician should have an opportunity to sit in opposition. Because life from the cheap seats, i.e. the opposition seats, is so much different than life from the government front bench. And even if you're a government backbencher, your opportunity to have a real say in what goes on in government and in legislating is very, very small. And so there has to be a mechanism whereby these things can actually flow, and anything we can do to make it less burdensome. You know, we have at 2 o'clock on the first day of every meeting of a house, there must be, the rule says, it's question time. And it's one of the only times the opposition has an opportunity to shine by the quality of questions they present. Of course, the government can then come in and say, and I did it when I was a part of a government that did it, and the present government does it, and every government has done it. We will suspend the rules. I'll move to suspend the rules to push question time after government business. And after government business is finished, you adjourn the House. And so therefore questions go on for months and months and months and never gets answered. And as a package of legislation that will make the House more accountable and more democratic and appear more, and members of Parliament can then have a better opportunity to represent the people that elected them and expose government, is to have a set time that is not amenable to a suspension of the rule. In the United Kingdom, for example, if the House is in session on a Tuesday at 2 o'clock, the Prime Minister comes and answers questions.
Wednesday, actually.
On a Wednesday, no matter what happens. If the House is in session, as night follows day, that is what happens. And my view is that on the first day of a meeting, at 2 o'clock, before any government business is done in the afternoon sessions for sure, there must be questions.
Yeah, and come back the next day to do government's business as
Absolutely.
necessary. But doesn't the Speaker of the House have more control?
Well, the Speaker of the House has control, but the Speaker of the House is elected by the majority of members of the House. And the Speaker of the House is usually a person handpicked by the Premier. And the Premier brings a person and says, this is the person who's going to be Speaker. That party in government votes in line, and that person becomes Speaker. The thing is that once you've been elected Speaker, and Speakers have always forgotten about this clause, it is difficult to remove them. You need a supermajority of the members of the House to remove them. And so whereas 50% plus one can put them in the chair, you need, I think it's a 2/3 majority, if I remember, to remove them from the chair. And if you're being a fair Speaker, the opposition is never going to vote to have it removed, and so your tenure is secure for that Parliament. But Speakers get elected, and they, in my recollection of what happens, they forget that part of the standing orders.
I think we've learned some interesting things tonight. This is a much more serious conversation than we normally have if we're standing around a bar having a nice drink of wine. But I've learned a lot from which I didn't know, and I think there's probably a lot more to discuss in that area. We've just hit upon one area of the government.
A very small area. We haven't even scratched the surface because we haven't got to second reading or the committee stage or third reading.
Right.
There's so much more that we can actually talk about.
But we do want to educate our listeners. We don't want to bore them to death.
That is absolutely true.
Yes. So I think I agree with you and that we've had a very interesting discussion, and there are a number of things that we talked about tonight that we can follow up and give us cause to follow up on future shows.
Well, let me just say this. An important thing I think that the public and that all of us here need to know is that the opposition, the government and the opposition have agreed on a time frame for constitutional talks in the UK. And there are many things that we've raised here tonight that will feature in those discussions, and the public will have an opportunity, because certainly the opposition's position was that unless and until there is a public discussion, consultation on the issues that are being presented to the UK, that the opposition will not be prepared to actually present them or be a part of those discussions. And so there's going to be an opportunity very soon that there'll be public consultation, town hall meetings on constitutional advancement, and the public will have an opportunity to actually be involved in all that as well.
Well, we hope you're going to be part of that, and you'll go along with a list of some of the important things you've dealt with tonight, and in your quieter moments in your law practice when your in tray is empty, and put together a list and be part of those public meetings.
Absolutely.
I thought that was very informative.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, DonHue and I had the privilege of being a part of the delegation advising the government on the 2006 Constitution. So it'll be interesting how we work towards the issues that, and this is 2000, and that'll be 2020. You know, and that's quite.
One of the things that we've been looking at in that whole, not to prolong the conversation, is a built-in mechanism for constitutional review at regular intervals, so that if the UK government decides, well, you know, it's not opportune for us to do so, they don't have the opportunity to say, well, come back next year or whatever, because the Constitution guarantees us a right to review at certain intervals. But I think that the Constitution that we have is the greatest obstacle to a government performing its functions, certainly what the people who elect them expect that they will perform. And it retards the system tremendously.
DonHue, this is a great start for conversations. We've had, I think, a very interesting discussion about the way government works in the country. I think we've set the foundation to have many more discussions like this. And I hope in the very near future we can bring in others who can help us share with our listeners around the world and all over the Turks and Caicos Islands about what goes on here, how our country is actually constructed from a governmental point of view. And then to talk more about the effectiveness of government in Turks and Caicos. That's something I'm really interested in getting into in the future. But I think it's a good start, if I may say so myself.
Yeah, I think as a pilot to what we've been talking about before during this program, this is a good start, and the way we've talked about expanding it into introducing other people, maybe experts, national figures. We also like the idea of having an interactive audience in some way, and that's what I'd like to see introduced, and I'm sure we can do it. And I think it's good value, and I think it's good educational value.
I think we can. And so for our listeners out in the Turks and Caicos, thank you for joining us with this initial show, this initial conversations, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
And that's Bentley, my dog.